"Take it, old man, and use it as your shroud when you rot in the mud of the north," the Countess spat, her voice cutting through the humid air of the parlor like a whip. Bento didn't move, his eyes fixed on the dirty, moth-eaten scrap of blue wool lying at his bare feet, while the wealthiest families of the Vale do Paraíba erupted in cruel, jagged laughter. They thought they were witnessing the final humiliation of a faithful servant, but they had no idea that this tattered rag held the power to burn their entire world to the ground. That afternoon, the silence of the big house was more suffocating than the heat of the Brazilian sun. Something was about to be uncovered that had been buried for decades, a secret so dark it could strip titles, reclaim fortunes, and rewrite the history of an entire bloodline. If you want to know how a simple piece of fabric changed the fate of a man and exposed the rotten heart of an empire, you need to stay with me until the very last word of this story. Before we continue, please give this video a rating from 0 to 10 in the comments and subscribe to the channel to support our work. It means the world to us and helps us keep telling these powerful stories. The year was 1881, and the Vale do Paraíba was a kingdom of coffee and shadows. The air was thick, smelling of overripe coffee cherries and the iron-scented dust of the red earth. The Fazenda das Almas, once the crown jewel of the region, stood as a monument to a dying era. Its white walls were stained with dampness, and its ornate windows looked out over the fields like the eyes of a tired giant. Inside, the atmosphere was even heavier. Count Valeriano de Alencar was dead, and his body had barely been cold before the vultures began to circle. Among those gathered in the parlor was Dr. Samuel. He sat in a corner, his linen suit frayed at the cuffs and his soul even more worn than his clothes. Samuel was a lawyer by trade, but a man defeated by life. He was the Count's nephew, though the title brought him no pride. Years ago, his own father, the Count's brother, had taken his own life after being crushed by Valeriano's ruthless greed. Samuel had spent the years since then drowning his idealism in bottles of cheap cachaça, processing the small, everyday cruelties of the local elite just to survive. He was a cog in a machine of misery, and he hated himself for it. Samuel stared at the flickering flame of a whale oil lamp on a side table. He felt a familiar emptiness in his chest, a hollow space where his courage used to live. To the world, he was just a disgraced relative, a functional alcoholic kept around for his legal signature. But tonight something felt different. The way the shadows danced on the walls of the big house felt like restless spirits waiting for a voice. Samuel reached into his pocket and touched a small silver flask, his only comfort in a room full of people who looked at him with nothing but pity or contempt. Across the room stood the Countess Isadora de Alencar. She was a woman whose beauty was a mask forged in ice. Her black silk mourning dress was worth more than most men earned in a lifetime, and she wore her grief like a trophy. She didn't care about her late husband. She cared about the Alencar name and the gold required to keep her in the high courts of Rio de Janeiro. Beside her stood the coronel, a man with a neck like a bull and a heart of stone, and a corrupt notary who had spent his career helping the Count falsify land deeds and suppress the freedom papers of those who had earned them. Then there was Bento. He stood near the door, a figure of mahogany skin and silent dignity. He was an elderly man, his back slightly bent by 40 years of service as the Count's personal valet. Bento knew every sin the Count had committed, every nightmare that had kept him awake, and every secret hidden behind the heavy oak doors of the study. He carried a physical mark of his loyalty, a missing finger on his left hand, lost years ago when he threw himself in front of a runaway carriage to save the Count's life. Now he was just a piece of property to be settled along with the furniture. The notary cleared his throat, the sound grating in the silent room. He began to read the will. It was a long, tedious document, filled with legal jargon that ensured Isadora would remain the queen of the estate. She received the lands, the mansion, the titles, and the human beings who worked the soil. But as the notary reached the final clause, his voice faltered. He looked up, his eyes darting toward the Countess before he continued. "And to my valet, Bento," the notary read, his voice barely a whisper, "I leave one specific item of my personal effects, the blue wool blanket kept in the cedar chest at the foot of my bed." A stunned silence fell over the parlor. Then the Countess started to laugh. It was a sharp, mocking sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "A blanket," she sneered, her eyes flashing with malice. "After 40 years of wagging his tail like a dog, my husband leaves him a tattered rag. It's perfect. It's exactly what he deserves." She signaled for a maid to bring the item. When the maid returned with the moth-eaten blue patchwork blanket, Isadora snatched it and threw it at Bento's feet. "Take it, slave," she hissed. "It's the only inheritance you'll ever see. Tomorrow you'll be sold to the sugar mills in the north to pay off the estate's wine debts. You can use that rag as a shroud when the sun finally breaks you." Bento didn't say a word. He slowly knelt, his joints creaking, and reached out for the fabric. As his fingers touched the wool, Samuel, watching from the corner, noticed something strange. Bento's hands weren't trembling with age or fear. They were trembling with recognition. He gripped the blanket as if it were made of solid gold, his eyes clouding with an emotion Samuel couldn't quite place. It wasn't despair. It was something much more dangerous. The Countess turned back to her guests, dismissing Bento as if he were a piece of trash. But Samuel couldn't look away. He saw the way Bento's thumb traced a specific, jagged tear in the corner of the fabric. It wasn't just a hole. It looked intentional, like a mark left by a craftsman. But this was only the beginning. Samuel felt a sudden sharp jolt of curiosity, a spark he hadn't felt in years. He knew the Count was a man of calculated cruelty, but he was also a man of deep, hidden guilt. Why would he leave a specific, useless rag to the man who knew all his secrets? That night, the fazenda was restless. The wind whistled through the coffee groves, sounding like 1,000 whispered warnings. Samuel couldn't sleep. The image of Bento's face in the parlor haunted him. He knew he should stay in his room, finish his bottle, and wait for the sun to rise so he could leave this cursed place forever. But the threads of truth were already beginning to pull at him. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and slipped out of the house, heading toward the Senzala, the dark, damp quarters where the workers were kept. The Senzala was a place of shadows and heavy silence. The smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies hung in the air. Samuel found Bento sitting on a wooden bench near a small dying fire. The blue blanket was spread across his lap. In the dim light, the fabric looked different. It wasn't just a blanket. It was a patchwork, a manta de retalhos, made of dozens of different pieces of cloth, stitched together with meticulous care. "You're taking a great risk coming here, Doctor," Bento said without looking up. His voice was deep and steady, far more articulate than the broken Portuguese the masters expected him to speak. "I saw your face in the parlor, Bento," Samuel replied, stepping into the circle of light. "My uncle was many things, but he was never random. He didn't give you that blanket to mock you. He gave it to you because he was afraid of what would happen if he didn't." Bento looked up then, his ancient eyes reflecting the orange glow of the embers. "The Count was a man who stole everything he ever had, including the breath from my father's lungs. But in the end, the ghosts wouldn't let him rest. He didn't give me this blanket, Doctor. He returned it." Samuel frowned, leaning closer. "What do you mean, returned it?" Bento ran his scarred hand over the blue wool. "My mother wove this. She was the nursemaid who raised the Count when he was a boy. She wasn't just a weaver. She was a storyteller. Every stitch, every patch, every pattern in this wool, it's not just decoration. It's a map. She knew the secrets of this land long before the Alancars arrived. She knew who really owned the soil we stand on." Samuel felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "A map? Bento, if the Countess finds out you're talking like this—" "The Countess only sees a rag because her heart is blind," Bento interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But you, Doctor, you have your father's eyes. You see the gaps in the story. You see the things that don't belong." He pointed to a small embroidered pattern near the center of the blanket, a series of white threads shaped like a weeping willow. "This isn't just a tree, it's a location. And what lies beneath it is the reason the Count died in terror." Samuel reached out, his fingers hovering over the fabric. He realized then that the inheritance wasn't a joke. It was a key. But as he looked into Bento's eyes, he also saw the immense danger they were in. The Countess wouldn't just sell Bento, she would destroy anyone who threatened her hold on the fazenda. And he, a disgraced lawyer with a penchant for the bottle, was the only person who could help. "If we do this," Samuel whispered, "there's no going back. They will come for us." Bento nodded slowly. "They have been coming for us for 300 years, Doctor. The question is, are you ready to finally stand in their way?" What Samuel didn't know yet was that the Black Ledger was real, and the truth hidden within its pages would shatter the very foundation of the Vale do Paraíba. But to find it, they would have to decode a language written in thread and blood, all while a ruthless slave hunter began to close in on them. And that was just the start of the nightmare. If you want to see how this mystery unfolds, don't forget to subscribe and leave your rating in the comments. We are just scratching the surface of the Alencar family's crimes. Samuel returned to his small, cramped room in the guest wing of the big house, but the walls seemed to be closing in on him. The smell of old paper and spilled liquor that usually comforted him now felt like a shroud. He sat at his desk, his hands hovering over a half-full bottle of cachaça, but for the first time in years he didn't pour a glass. His mind was racing, replaying the way Bento's scarred fingers had traced the embroidery on that blue blanket. It wasn't just a rag, it was a testament. But who would believe a disgraced drunk and an aging slave against the word of the most powerful woman in the province? The morning sun rose over the Vale do Paraíba, bleeding red across the coffee fields. Samuel watched from his window as the overseers began to rouse the workers. The crack of the whip in the distance sounded like a punctuation mark on a history of pain. He knew he had to move fast. The Countess Isidora was already making arrangements with the slave traders from the north. Bento had days, perhaps only hours, before he was chained and marched away to a slow death in the sugar mills. But Samuel had no idea that the willow tree was only the first step into a labyrinth of blood and ink. At breakfast, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken threats. The Countess sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her black lace veil pushed back to reveal eyes that were as cold as a winter frost. She didn't look at Samuel as he entered. She was too busy reviewing a ledger with the coronel. The coronel was a man who smelled of tobacco and horses, his presence a constant reminder of the physical force that backed the Alencar name. "The sale is finalized for Friday," Isidora said, her voice smooth and without a trace of hesitation. 40 souls, including the valet. "The price is lower than I wanted, but we need the liquidity before the court season begins in Rio." "Bento is old, Isidora," the coronel grunted, leaning back in his chair. "He's more trouble than he's worth. He knows too much about the old count's habits. Better to send him where he can't talk." Samuel felt a cold knot of anger tighten in his stomach. He kept his head down, pretending to focus on his coffee, but his ears were ringing. He realized then that Bento wasn't being sold just for money. He was being silenced. The Countess was afraid. She knew that Bento held fragments of the truth, even if she didn't know about the blanket, and that fear made her more dangerous than any beast in the forest. "I'll need the final signatures on the transfer papers, Samuel," Isidora said, finally turning her gaze toward him. "I expect them on my desk by sunset. No excuses this time, no episodes with the bottle." "Of course, Aunt Isidora," Samuel replied, his voice flat. "The law requires everything to be in order." He left the room as quickly as he could, but as he crossed the courtyard he felt a pair of eyes burning into the back of his neck. Standing near the stable was a man Samuel had seen before, but never spoken to, Lucio, the Capitão do Mato. He was a man who lived on the fringes of the plantation, a hunter of humans who was rumored to have the tracking skills of a jaguar and the mercy of a stone. Lucio tipped his sweat-stained hat to Samuel, a slow mocking gesture that sent a chill down the lawyer's spine. The hunt had already begun. Samuel knew he couldn't go straight to the Senzala. Instead, he headed toward the outskirts of the estate, toward a place known as the Tree of Sighs. It was a massive ancient weeping willow that sat near a stagnant pond, a place where the workers were often sent for punishment, or where they gathered in secret to pray. If the blanket's embroidery meant anything, this was the starting point. But the earth doesn't keep secrets forever. He reached the tree and began to circle it, his eyes searching the gnarled roots and the scarred bark. He felt like a fool, a man looking for a ghost in a landscape of misery. But then he saw it, carved deep into the wood, almost overgrown by years of neglect, was a small mark that matched the white threads on the blanket. It was a cross entwined with a vine. Samuel knelt in the mud, digging with his bare hands. His fingernails tore, and the humid heat made his breath come in ragged gasps. After what felt like hours, his fingers hit something hard. It wasn't a chest of gold or a bag of coins. It was a small, rusted iron box, sealed with wax to keep out the dampness. Inside the box was a single piece of parchment, yellowed and brittle with age. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs as he unfolded it. It wasn't a legal deed, not yet. It was a letter, written in a shaky but educated hand. It was a confession from the Count's brother, Samuel's own father. "To whoever finds this," the letter began, "my brother Valeriano did not inherit the Fazenda das Almas. He stole it. The true owner was a man of honor, a freedman named Joaquim, who saved our father's life and was granted these lands in a deed that Valeriano destroyed. I have lived in silence and shame, but I cannot take this truth to my grave. The proof lies where the shadow of the chapel meets the stone of the first foundation." Samuel felt as if he had been struck in the chest. His father hadn't just lost everything to greed. He had been a witness to a monumental crime. The Joachim mentioned in the letter, Samuel knew that name. Joachim was Bento's father, and it was here that many men would have stopped, paralyzed by the weight of the revelation. But Samuel couldn't. He looked up and saw Lucio, the slave hunter, standing on the ridge above the pond. The man wasn't moving, just watching, his rifle resting casually across his saddle. The loop was closing. Samuel tucked the letter into his vest and began the long walk back. He needed to find Bento, but he also needed another piece of the puzzle. He went to the kitchen, a bustling, smoky room at the back of the big house, where Tia Maria, the oldest woman on the plantation, ruled over the wood-fired stoves. She was a woman who saw everything and forgot nothing. "Tia Maria," Samuel whispered, leaning over the counter as if asking for a snack. "Tell me about Joachim. Tell me about the man who lived here before the Count took the title." Tia Maria froze, her wooden spoon hovering over a pot of beans. She looked around to make sure no one was listening, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and ancient sorrow. "You shouldn't speak that name, little doctor. That name is buried under the red dirt. Joachim was a king among us. He had the papers, the seals, the promise of the old emperor. But the Count had the guns and the law on his side." "Where is the deed, Maria?" Samuel pressed, his voice urgent. "Where did he hide the proof?" "Joachim was smart," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "He knew he couldn't keep it in his house. He gave it to the one person the Count would never suspect. He gave it to the earth itself, but only the blanket can tell you the exact spot. The blue wool is the only thing that remembers." Samuel realized then that the Black Ledger wasn't just a book of accounts. It was a collection of original documents, birth records, and the true deed of the Fazenda, hidden in locations encoded in the patchwork. The Count, in his final years, had been haunted by Joachim's ghost. He hadn't destroyed the evidence because he was a coward. He had hidden it, perhaps as a final twisted way to seek forgiveness, or perhaps as a trap for the wife he loathed. But time was a luxury they didn't have. That evening, as the shadows stretched long across the veranda, the Countess Isidora called Samuel into the study. The room was filled with the scent of expensive cigars and the heavy, sweet aroma of port wine. "The papers, Samuel," she said, stretching out her hand. "The transfer of the workers. Give them to me." Samuel reached into his pocket, his hand trembling slightly. He had the transfer papers, but he also had the letter from his father. He looked at Isidora, at the cold arrogance in her eyes, and he realized that if he handed over those documents, Bento would be gone by morning. The truth would stay buried forever, and he would go back to his bottle, a broken man in a broken world. "I don't have them yet, Isidora," Samuel said, his voice surprisingly steady. "There's a discrepancy in the records, a name that doesn't match the original land grant." The Countess's expression didn't change, but Samuel saw the way her fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. "A name? What name?" "Joachim," Samuel replied, watching her face. For a second, the mask slipped, A flash of pure, unadulterated terror crossed Isadora's features before she forced a laugh. A ghost story, Samuel. You've been drinking again. There is no Joachim. There is only the Alencar name. Is that why Lucio is following me? Samuel asked, taking a step closer. Is that why you're so eager to sell an old man who can barely walk? Get out, she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. Finish the papers tonight, or I will have the coroner deal with you as he deals with any other insubordinate on this estate. You are a guest here only by my mercy, Samuel. Don't forget that. Samuel backed out of the room, but he knew he had just declared war. He hurried toward the senzala, his heart pounding. He found Bento waiting for him, the blue blanket wrapped around his shoulders like a royal robe. She knows, Bento, Samuel whispered, catching his breath. She knows I'm looking. Then we must move tonight, Bento said, his eyes burning with a fierce light. The next patch on the blanket is the chapel, under the first stone of the foundation. That's where the ledger is, Doctor. That's where the life of my father is waiting to be found. But as they turned to leave the senzala, a shadow blocked the doorway. It was Lucio, the slave hunter. He didn't say a word, but the moonlight glinted off the barrel of his rifle. He stepped into the light, a cruel smile playing on his lips. The Countess told me you might try to take a walk tonight, Doctor. She told me to make sure you didn't get lost. Samuel looked at Bento, then at the man with the gun. He realized that the threads of truth were about to be tested by fire, and the secret they were about to uncover was far more explosive than he ever imagined. If you want to know what was hidden beneath the chapel and how Samuel faced the man who lived to hunt, you cannot miss the next part of this story. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments, would you risk your life for a truth that the world has forgotten? The cold steel of Lucio's rifle barrel caught a sliver of moonlight, and for a heartbeat, Samuel forgot how to breathe. The slave hunter didn't move, his silhouette as jagged and unforgiving as the mountains surrounding the vale. He was a man who didn't need to shout to be heard. His silence was a death sentence. But Samuel, fueled by a cocktail of terror and a newfound burning sense of purpose, did something he hadn't done in years. He stood tall. He didn't reach for a bottle. He reached for the authority he had spent a decade trying to drown. "Step aside, Lucio," Samuel said, his voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even himself. "I am a representative of the law and a member of the Alencar family. If you interfere with my investigation into the estate's legal discrepancies, I will ensure your contract is terminated before the sun reaches the horizon. Or perhaps you'd like to explain to the Countess why you're holding a rifle to her nephew's chest." Lucio's eyes narrowed, a low, guttural growl vibrating in his throat. He looked at Bento, then back at the disgraced lawyer. He was a predator, and he could smell the fear radiating off Samuel. But he also knew the power of a doctor's word in a society built on titles and paper. Slowly, with a mocking grin that revealed yellowed teeth, Lucio lowered the rifle. "The Countess wants those papers, Doctor. Don't make me come looking for them in your pockets. It gets messy when I have to dig." Lucio stepped back into the shadows of the stable, but Samuel knew he wasn't gone. He was just waiting. "Go, Bento," Samuel whispered, his hands shaking as the adrenaline began to fade. "To the chapel. Now." They moved through the coffee groves like ghosts, avoiding the main paths. The chapel of the Fazenda das Almas was a small ornate building of white stone and dark wood, sitting on a hill overlooking the slave quarters. It was a place of forced piety, where the Count had sat in his velvet-lined pew while the people he owned knelt on the hard floor behind him. To Samuel, the building had always felt like a tomb, a place where prayers went to die. But as they reached the heavy oak doors, Bento pointed to the blue blanket again. "The pattern of the lilies, Doctor," Bento murmured, his voice thick with the weight of memory. "My mother didn't just stitch flowers. She stitched the alignment of the altar. Look at the way the petals point." Samuel held his breath as they entered the silent, incense-scented darkness. The moonlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting long, bloody red shadows across the floor. They moved toward the side of the altar, toward the foundation stone that bore the Alencar crest. Samuel knelt, his fingers tracing the cold, damp stone until he felt a slight indentation, a cross entwined with a vine, identical to the mark on the willow tree. But this stone must weigh hundreds of pounds, Samuel whispered, panic rising in his chest. We can't move this, Bento. Not without tools, not without help. The Count was a man of many fears, but he was also a man of secrets, Bento replied, his eyes searching the base of the stone. He didn't want to move the earth. He wanted to hide within it. Bento reached into a small gap between the stone and the floorboards, his scarred fingers fumbling until there was a sharp click. The foundation stone didn't move, but a small wooden panel at its base popped open. Inside was a cavity lined with rotting velvet, and there, wrapped in oilskin to protect it from the centuries of dampness, was the Black Ledger. Samuel pulled it out with trembling hands. It wasn't just a book of accounts, it was a diary of a crime that spanned generations. As he flipped through the brittle pages by the light of a stolen candle, the true horror of the Alencar legacy began to unfold. It wasn't just about land or money. It was about the systematic theft of human souls. My God, Samuel breathed, his eyes scanning the entries. The manumission papers. Bento, look. Here is your father's name. Joachim. He didn't just earn his freedom. He bought the freedom of 20 others. And here, the deed. The original land grant. The handwriting changed from the old Count's elegant script to the frantic, guilt-ridden scrawl of Samuel's uncle. The documents revealed a truth so explosive, it could tear the social fabric of the entire province. Count Valeriano hadn't inherited the Fazenda das Almas. He had lost it in a high-stakes gamble to Joachim, a freedman who had become a successful merchant. But instead of honoring the debt, Valeriano had used his influence with the bishop and the local governor to have Joachim accused of a crime he didn't commit. They had murdered him in a prison accident and forged the current titles. But that was only the beginning. The ledger contained a list of names, men and women who were legally free but held in bondage through falsified records. It contained records of bribes paid to the very judges and officials who were supposed to uphold the law. The Alencar fortune was a mountain built on a foundation of lies and blood, and the most recent entries, they were in Isadora's hand. She knew everything. She had been the one to suggest selling the troublesome witnesses to the north. We have it, Bento, Samuel said, his voice a mixture of triumph and absolute dread. We have the proof. This ledger can bring them all down. The bishop, the governor, everyone. But they have the guns, Doctor, Bento reminded him, his face illuminated by the flickering candle. And Friday is coming. The traders will be here at dawn. If we don't use this tonight, it will be nothing but a pile of ash by tomorrow. Samuel looked at the ledger, then at the blue blanket draped over Bento's arm. He realized then that he couldn't just take this to a local court. The local court was bought and paid for. He couldn't go to the police. He needed a stage. He needed witnesses that even the Countess couldn't silence. He needed the world to see the rot behind the black lace and the silk mourning gowns. The reception, Samuel whispered, the idea forming in his mind like a lightning strike. The grand reception tomorrow night. The governor will be there, the bishop will be there. The entire elite of the Vale will be in the big house to celebrate Isadora's victory and the sale of the workers. You would walk into the lion's den, Doctor, Bento asked, his brow furrowed. I won't just walk in, Bento, I'm going to tear the roof off, Samuel replied, a cold, hard resolve settling over him. But we need more than just this book. We need the physical evidence she can't deny. The patterns on this blanket, they lead to one more place, don't they? Bento nodded slowly, his gaze turning toward the big house. The study, beneath the floorboards of the Count's own desk. That's where he kept the original seals, the ones he used to forge the signatures. If you have those, you have the weapon that killed my father. And that was the moment Samuel realized the true cost of justice. To get those seals, he would have to go back into the heart of the enemy's territory, right under the nose of a woman who was already suspicious and a hunter who was waiting for an excuse to pull the trigger. But he looked at Bento, at the missing finger, the map of scars and the eyes that still held hope after 40 years of hell, and he knew he couldn't turn back. But as they prepared to leave the chapel, a distant sound echoed through the night. It was the sound of dogs, the deep rhythmic baying of the Countess's hounds. Lucio hadn't just been waiting, he had been preparing. The hunt wasn't just starting, it was accelerating. And it was here that many men would have surrendered to the darkness. But Samuel gripped the black ledger and the blue blanket, knowing that the threads of truth were the only thing keeping them from the abyss. If you want to see how Samuel and Bento navigate the final, most dangerous part of their journey, and what happens when the truth is finally brought into the light of the big house, you must stay tuned. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments. Do you think Samuel has what it takes to face the woman who destroyed his family? The clock is ticking and the hounds are closing in. The baying of the hounds was no longer a distant echo. It was a rhythmic, terrifying pulse that shook the very air of the plantation. Samuel and Bento stood frozen in the shadow of the chapel, the black ledger clutched against Samuel's chest like a shield. They knew Lucio was coming and he wasn't alone. The slave hunter had the full authority of the Countess and the sharpened teeth of his dogs. But the darkness wasn't their only enemy. Time was running out, and the most critical piece of the puzzle, the physical proof of the forgery, was still hidden inside the mouth of the beast. "Take the ledger, Bento," Samuel whispered, his voice urgent and sharp. "Hide it in the old grain silo near the edge of the woods. If they catch me, the world must still see those pages. Do you understand?" "But the seals, Doctor," Bento replied, his eyes reflecting the pale moonlight. "You cannot face her without the seals. They are the only things that prove the hand that wrote the lies." "I know," Samuel said, a grim determination settling over him. "I'm going into the big house. It's the last place they'll expect me to be while they're hunting us in the fields. Go, now!" Bento vanished into the darkness of the coffee groves, moving with a silent grace that 40 years of survival had taught him. Samuel turned toward the mansion, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt like a man walking toward his own execution. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a coward. He felt like the lawyer his father had always wanted him to be. The big house was a hive of activity. Servants were rushing back and forth, polishing silver and hanging heavy velvet drapes for the reception. The scent of roasted meats and expensive perfumes began to mask the smell of the red earth. Samuel slipped through the servants' entrance, his frayed suit allowing him to blend into the shadows of the hallways. He made his way toward the Count's study, the one room Isadora had kept locked since the funeral. But he found that he was wrong. The door wasn't locked. It was slightly ajar. Samuel peered inside. The room was bathed in the orange glow of a dozen candles. Isadora was standing by the window, her back to him. She was holding a glass of sherry, her black lace veil draped over a chair. Beside her stood the coronel, his massive frame blocking the light from the fireplace. "The traders will be here at 4 in the morning, the coronel was saying, his voice a low rumble. "Once the valet is on that ship, the last link to Joachim is gone. But what about the lawyer? Your nephew is becoming a nuisance, Isadora." "Samuel is a drunkard and a failure," Isadora replied, her voice dripping with contempt. "He has no proof, only hallucinations fueled by cachaça. Once the reception is over and the governor has signed the new tax exemptions, I will have Samuel escorted from the property, permanently." "And if he found the ledger?" Isadora turned, a cold, predatory smile playing on her lips. "Then he will die with it. Lucio has his orders. No one leaves this estate with the Alencar secrets." Samuel waited until they left the room to join the guests in the garden. His breath came in shallow, jagged gasps. He moved toward the massive mahogany desk, his eyes searching the floorboards beneath it. He remembered the patterns on the blue blanket, the way the stitches converged near the corner of the rug. He kicked the rug aside and knelt, his fingers searching for a loose seam in the wood. And then he found it, a hidden latch, perfectly concealed within the grain of the oak. He pulled the board up. Inside was a velvet-lined box containing 3 heavy brass seals. They bore the official marks of the provincial notary and the Imperial Land Office. But as Samuel held them to the candlelight, he saw the truth. They were replicas, perfectly crafted forgeries designed to mimic the ones held in the capital. Beside them was a stack of blank parchments already stamped with the stolen seals, waiting for the names of the next victims. "I have you," Samuel whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of horror and triumph. "I finally have you." But as he moved to tuck the box into his coat, the door to the study swung open. Lucio stood there, his rifle leveled at Samuel's head. The slave hunter's eyes were cold, and his finger was already tightening on the trigger. "The Countess said you'd come here, Doctor. She said you were just predictable enough to walk into your own trap." "Then she's already lost, Lucio," Samuel said, standing his ground. "Because the truth isn't just in this room anymore. It's everywhere." Lucio laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "The truth doesn't matter when you're 6 feet under the coffee trees. Give me the box." Samuel looked at the seals, then at the man with the gun. He knew that the next few minutes would decide the fate of every soul on the Fazenda das Almas, and it was here that he would have to make the ultimate choice, his life or the justice his father died for. But he didn't have to choose alone. From the hallway, a sudden loud crash echoed, the sound of the great bell in the chapel ringing out of season. It was Bento. The signal had been given. The workers were rising, not with blades, but with the one thing the Countess feared most: their presence. If you want to see the explosive final confrontation in the ballroom and find out how a torn blanket became the shroud of an empire, you cannot miss the final part of this story. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments, what would you do if you were staring down the barrel of a gun with the truth in your hands? The grand finale is just moments away, and nothing will ever be the same again. The grand ballroom of the big house was a sea of lace, silk, and hypocrisy. Crystal chandeliers cast a shimmering light over the province's elite, while the governor and the bishop laughed over glasses of imported champagne. Countess Isidora stood at the center of it all, a queen in her own mind, celebrating the final sale of the valueless workers. She thought she had won. She thought the silence of the grave had finally claimed the secrets of the Alencar name. But justice, even when buried under years of lies, has a way of finding the light. The heavy oak doors burst open, and the music died a sudden, jagged death. Samuel stepped into the light, but he wasn't the man they remembered. He was covered in the red dust of the fields, his eyes clear and his voice echoing with a power that silenced the room. Beside him stood Bento, draped in the blue patchwork blanket, and behind them a silent wall of workers who had walked from the Senzala to witness the end of an era. "The party is over, Isidora," Samuel said, walking toward the center of the room. He didn't pull out a glass. He pulled out the black ledger and the box of forged brass seals. In front of the bishop and the governor, Samuel unrolled the blue blanket across the polished floor. He showed them how the stitches matched the hidden coordinates in the ledger, the exact spots where the original deeds and the murder confession had been buried. Isidora tried to laugh, but her voice was a thin, trembling reed. "He's a drunkard. This is a fabrication." She lunged for the fireplace, trying to throw the documents into the flames, but the coronel, seeing the tide turn and fearing his own ruin, caught her arm. The evidence was undeniable. The Count had never owned the fazenda. He had stolen it from Bento's father, and Isidora had spent years forging the blood that sustained her status. The ruin was absolute. By the time the sun rose over the Vale do Paraíba, the Alencar legacy was ash. Isidora was stripped of her titles and exiled to a crumbling house in a distant town, her name a curse among the elite she worshipped. Samuel used the recovered wealth and the leverage of the scandal to ensure the immediate and permanent manumission of every soul on the estate. The story ends on the veranda of the big house. The gates are wide open, and the air no longer smells of iron and fear. Samuel stands sober, watching the sun climb over the coffee groves. Bento sits nearby, the blue blanket across his lap, telling a young boy the story of Joaquim and the threads that refuse to break. Dignity is a fabric that can be torn, but it can always be rewoven by those with the courage to seek the truth. The blue blanket catches the morning wind, flying like the flag of a new, free nation. If this story moved you and reminded you that justice always finds its way, please subscribe to the channel and support our work. We bring you stories of courage and redemption every week. Leave a comment with a rating from 0 to 10 for this journey. We truly want to know what you thought. Thank you for staying until the end, and we'll see you in the next story.